Welcome to the Vote Common Good Daily Podcast. I'm Daniel Dietrich, your host, your producer, and today is Friday, June 11th. Typically on Fridays we talk science or economics, but today is a little different. If you were with us yesterday, you know that Doug Pagit, our executive director, was in Washington, D.C., participating in a march by people of faith demanding a pathway to citizenship for those who are undocumented. And while he was there, it's important work that we're also focused on this year and this fall. You might have seen some stuff coming out about the We the People ride. We are spending this fall focused on immigration reform, drawing attention to conditions at the border. And so head over to wethepeopleride.org for more information on that. We're just trying to find a common good way forward when it comes to immigration and our borders. Trying to find a compassionate way to welcome those in who want to come here. But while he was in D.C., he sat down with Bishop Mary Ann Budde to talk about her role in the Episcopal Church and that infamous day when Donald Trump tear-gassed his own citizens so he could hold a Bible outside St. John's Church. You might remember this photo where he's holding a Bible literally upside down after tear-gassing peaceful protesters and clergy to clear the space in front of St. John's Church. That was one of Bishop Budde's churches. So she had to respond to that moment and live in that tension of church and state and really talk some truth to power. She had some strong words for the president, and hope you give that episode a listen. That's from yesterday. You can check that out on our podcast page. But while Doug was doing all this traveling and marching, he also sat down with the hosts of the podcast UnPresidented. It's a political podcast. It's not religious. It's just progressive politics. And he sat down with the hosts on the other side of the interview desk this time. And so he was asking a lot of questions about Vote Common Good, our work in the previous election to prevent the re-election of Donald Trump, especially among faith voters. And what I love about this interview is its questions and perspectives from outside of the religious bubble that I typically find myself in, and maybe you're the same way. So it's perspectives and questions like, I didn't know there were progressive evangelical Christians, and just some of the sort of dumbfoundedness around how could people who claim to follow Jesus vote for a guy like Donald Trump and continue to support a person like Donald Trump. So it's a great conversation. There's a little bit of a collaboration today. We're going to listen in on that conversation. And most of the time, I'd tell you to hop over to our podcast, hit that subscribe button, and you still definitely should. But today, hop over to the UnPresidented Podcast show and show them some love. And now here is our executive director, Doug Pagit, sitting down with the hosts of UnPresidented. Let's get into their interview.
Smart politics for stupid times. Welcome to the Unprecedented Podcast with John Aravosis and Cliff Schechter.
Welcome back, everybody. Thursday, June 10th. John Aravosis here with Cliff Schechter. And Cliff, today we have another guest. We are on a roll here. Guest after guest.
People just got tired of hearing us talk, John, and we have to just accept that.
Well, not that changes with the guests, but today's guest is Doug Pagit. Doug is the executive director of Vote Common Good, a nonprofit that tries to invite religious voters to take an off-ramp from the Republican Party. Doug is a progressive evangelical pastor from Minneapolis. Doug, welcome. And let me start with that description right there. What is a progressive evangelical pastor? I would have never thought such a thing existed.
Yeah. Well, hey, John. Hey, Cliff. Glad to be here.
Sure.
You know, the expression of being an evangelical it's not meant to be synonymous with being conservative, certainly not synonymous with being right-wing. It's sort of this non-denominational experience of Christianity by which people think a lot about how the teachings of Jesus should compel them in their life to be of good to the world.
Right.
And that has been taken over the last 40 years by a particular conservative expression of Christianity and of cultural engagement. And so there's this little sliver of us, I don't know, maybe 20% of evangelicals who would say, hey, we're not in it for the conservative expression. In fact, we would even say that the teachings of Jesus should teach us and call us to more inclusion, to more kindness, to more openness.
So Jesus wasn't a supply sider?
That's right.
Sorry, I can't help it.
Carrying a Kalashnikov.
Jesus said a couple things about a few things here and there about helping the poor that would make me think, maybe he wouldn't be a big fan of Reaganomics. And I don't know. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Sorry,
no, totally. And this is actually the work that a lot of us have been doing for a long time. Is that this call not only to your individual spirituality, but to a collective experience of Christianity with other people, really should call you to something that puts a pretty serious critique on, generally on capitalism as a whole. It's something that wants people to think about the benefit and the experience of others before yourself. So any of the trickle down, any of the supply side, I guess a reasonable Christian person could hold those views, but they just have to do some very sophisticated ethical math to make that work.
Right. I mean, it seems to me what they pulled off, I don't mean to interrupt you, but what's incredible is you hear all these right wingers. I studied history and I know a lot. I mean, people don't get that a lot of progressive movement forward. I mean, think of MLK as the easiest one that everybody knows, was led by progressive religious organizations in this country. Right. I mean, a lot of it. Right. And so people forget that. And then they forget that what the right successfully pulled off by fusing, the moral majority with the supply siders in a way that made no sense unless you sort of lied to people. I mean, the classic example, Ayn Rand, who they all loved, they had to find ways to get around what she really said because she hated all religion, because she realized religion, the progressive side of religion, called for people to unite and to share. Right. Go ahead. Let me kick it to you.
No, I think that's exactly right. It's a bit remarkable. And a number of us who've worked for the last number of decades on a different experience of Christianity and politics and cultural engagement have really had to stand in awe at how the religious right could even consider using Christianity's teachings as its rationale for its behavior and for its belief. And frankly, the fact that a lot of us in the religious community have just ceded this land and this territory to the religious right and have given it over to them. I often refer to it as, turning the land over to the squatters. That's really where the problem lies. So a lot of the work that we're trying to do is within the religious communities. Sometimes it's with leaders, sometimes it's with influencers and pastors and people, in hierarchies. But we really see a people movement brewing among people with evangelical background and evangelical interests to call for a different way forward for all of us. The struggle then is that after 40 years of religious people and evangelicals acting so badly, should they be welcomed into the progressive political movements or not? I think a lot of us have some work to do to prove that we're willing to really be as open and inclusive as we say that we are. So that's where a lot of the struggle comes from. It's really not trying to. When I'm in a theological conversation with my right-wing friends, that's an easy conversation to have. When I'm in a conversation with my political friends on the progressive side and they look at me scantly and say, really? Are you guys really trustworthy on this? That's where more of the work has to be done, because so many of us have not done the work that we need to do to be engaged in caring about the whole and to a degree that we need to.
Where do we find, you say 20% of evangelicals are progressive. Where do they tend to be located? What states, what areas?
Yeah, they're kind of scattered around the country, but this is going to surprise some people to know that like in Texas and North Carolina, there's a whole string of people who identify as Baptist, but they're not part of the Southern Baptists. They're part of these break-off groups from the Southern Baptists they're quite progressive. So in Texas, North Carolina, Georgia, you have huge swaths of these collective Baptists, sometimes they're called. Mm-hmm. And so you'll see them there. In the Midwest, it comes out a little differently. It's not the Baptist expression. It's sort of the Free Church, the Reformed churches. And what happens, like it happens inside of a lot of other religious traditions, is you get mixed congregations, right? So you have a congregation that'll be 75% for Donald Trump, but that other 25% is making a very strong argument that they don't want to support those policies and they want to support a political agenda and a religious agenda that's much different. So inside the very congregations and communities that do tend to lean conservative, and I'm not trying to whitewash the fact that 70% of evangelicals are hardwired into the Republican agenda, but that other group, it's a remnant that has a lot of power actually to be organized. Now, the problem, part of the work that we're doing at Vote Common Good and the other efforts that I'm involved in, is a lot of these people feel alone and they feel very isolated. They feel like, I know it's me and a few friends at my church, but how can we raise our voice in relationship to all these other people? So we do a lot of online organizing. We write books, we produce audio and video content. Like, we're trying to create these spaces for people to realize that they're not alone in this work. And it's actually true of a lot of pastors as well. You would be surprised how many people are leading congregations where the congregation feels like it leans very conservative on social issues, but the pastor is not that way. And I'm in a lot of conversations with pastors who are saying, hey, how do you think how can I make this shift in a way where I don't lose my job, I don't blow up my church? Because, these people that get into religion as a profession, oftentimes they do it for really good reasons, and they tend not to be people that want to rock the boat or tear their churches apart or anything else, and they certainly don't want to do it over some political squabble. They're like, hey, I'll do it over, big issues for the care of humanity or the planet.
That's something that I've often said about when people over the years, actually, I do want to ask you in a second, why even talk about religion? Because I know some of our listeners are going, God, I hate religion. They've always been bad to me as a woman, as gay, as black, whatever. Right. So let's get to that in a second. But of course, now that I said that, because I didn't want to forget that point, I'm forgetting the point I was going to ask you. What were you just saying about you got me at something really interesting I wanted to ask you. Oh, the pastors. And God, it's how they reach out to their flock.
That they don't want to blow up their churches. They don't see them for politics purposes.
When people on our side would bemoan the fact that, the religious right is so active on the Republican side, and on our side, where is our religious left, so to speak? And one of the things, it always seemed to me that as much as you do have a segment of religion on the left that can be very radical, right? I mean, especially, I was going to say, at least I know back in the 80s, right? I mean, you had some people, going to the Central America, and people who were really almost revolutionaries in a way, not in a bad way necessarily, but generally speaking, I feel like on their side, some of the religious people are just kind of mean and angry, and the religious leaders, and the anti-gays, the anti-everything, they're fire and brimstone. Whereas on our side, it's love thy neighbor, kumbaya, and it's kind of hard to fight fire and brimstone with love, even though I know Jesus would say do that. But as a political person, loving thy neighbor doesn't really get you often very far, at least the work Cliff and I do. I don't want to paint Cliff as not loving his neighbor, but
my neighbors are actually pretty nice people. Like, we have cookouts with them here and there, throw football. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. Look, I mean,
I'm the comic relief here.
But you made me think of that with what you were saying, where I sometimes think the problem is that on our side, the religious people are the way you're supposed to be.
Well, one of the things that we're saying I say to my fellow religious leaders all the time on the left and the progressive side is, you got to turn off, you got to press that mute button. You've got your mute button turned on, like you're in a constant Zoom meeting.
Right.
The problem is that hate and hateful and fear mongering seems to engender in an individual and a community that a very loud response, right? Hate and loud volume seem to go together. For some reason, we believe that love, inclusion, kindness, goodness should also be quiet, meek, and
Yeah.
restrained.
Yeah.
And that's a combination that shouldn't be there. We should, as we say in our organization, we should love out loud and a whole lot louder
Right.
than we are. So part of the problem is that so many religious leaders are so quiet. I was just in a conversation with hundreds of them here. I'm in Washington, D.C. today, even though I live in Minneapolis. And a number of us were together, and I'm around religious leaders on the left all the time. And we always bemoan with each other that, like, why, when we start talking publicly about politics or faith, we won't quote Jesus. We won't even tell people that we're religious leaders. We'll say, like, we're community organizers, because there's something in the system that is nervous about the very thing you raised, right? Where we know that religion has treated people badly. So rather than replacing that with good religious practice and common good religious extension, we just get ashamed, embarrassed, and quiet. And we just assume, quote, Rumi as, quote, Jesus. We'll give you a Gandhi illustration and not a religious, Christian religious expression.
I forget this point, but I would say to me, the broader point of this is actually you guys aren't much different in that way than a lot of the left, which John and I talk about on here, is that because we believe in the rightness and the goodness of our intentions, because we believe we're out there trying to help people, we sometimes forget that actually we are in a political war of ideas, and it does matter. In other words, if you're just saying the right things, because that's what Jesus would do, and that's what other religious figures, if you study them, care about people, would do. You wouldn't have to get out there and message correctly, right? You would just share the message of love. And we get that on the left sometimes too, whereas we think, well, we have this great policy, it's going to give more people health care. We just need to do that. We don't need to actually go out there
and we don't need to sell it.
Right. We don't need to sort of undercut the other side and point out where they're lying and all that.
Yeah, that would be mean.
So I don't think you're unique. You guys are unique that way. I think you're actually part of the broader thing that John and I spent a lot of time talking about in this podcast that we have to all fight, which is knowing that we're doing the right thing and the good thing, the thing that makes this a better planet and a better country. But sometimes, even though we'd rather not, we do have to be willing to get into the mud with them and point out where they are hypocrites and where they are dishonest. And I know that must be even harder for you to do if you're coming from a religious standpoint. But, people are being hurt by these guys. I can't even imagine, and maybe I'll just throw it to you here, what you feel like when you see these, Joel Osteen types or whatever, who are like, oh, I need you to give me more money so I can get my plane. My first plane isn't working. I need the second one. I mean, what these guys have taken the message and done with it is, I would think it would make your skin crawl. Certainly makes mine. But
it's
I don't want to speak
true.
for you.
No, you're right. Like, it's certainly true. But I'm one of those people who believes the best way to counteract a negative message is with a better message. Right. And one of the reasons I like being from the evangelical tradition is that in the evangelical tradition, embedded in the name is the notion of evangelism, right? That you're an evangelist. In other words, you're asking people to consider your way of life and to join you in it. Now, that should not be coercive. It certainly should not be punitive. It should always be open-handed and considerate and invitational. But if we don't try to win the argument by having a positive calling for how we're going to live in the world and how we should be, and we think that the best way to convince someone to move in their thinking or their behavior to another way is by showing them that they're hypocrites, that doesn't work. Like, everyone knows they're a hypocrite. Like, everyone I've ever met is like, I never really live up to the things that I espouse. So telling people, amplifying how there's a failure is only so motivating. Part of the problem is there's not a compelling progressive vision for how we ought to live that is catchy, that is shorthand, that is meaningful. Like, part of following Jesus is you're like, the thing Jesus was good at, he was really good at catchphrases, actually. Right. Like, think of all the things you know about Jesus. Most of them can fit in a tweet.
That's true.
I hate to say
poetic.
It reminds me.
Turn the other cheek, and I mean, it's true.
Love your neighbors, you love yourself.
But you know what? You're
bless
both
those
making
who persecute you. Do good to those who.
I don't mean to jump in, but you know what? You're both making me think of is Donald Trump.
Totally.
But the catch again, and so it's funny. Some of our people didn't like our last podcast, Cliff, because they thought we were praising Trump. But Trump knows how to message, and he had the catchy catchphrases, fake news. Or, I mean, all the others. Hillary, was it?
I'd like to make clear to anybody listening, by the way, John, that we're never
Hillary.
praising Donald Trump. We have to analyze honestly.
Yeah.
And if he does a good job
He
at
messages
convincing
well,
people,
though.
we need to talk about that. As a human being, he'd be just about the best person on the planet, I would praise. But that's not what we're discussing here.
Right. But if a man is a fashion icon, as Donald Trump has shown himself to be, you just have to give him credit for that. Like, you can't, you don't get a pair of pants and a jacket like that without.
Right. How many people don't put pants on backwards and have toilet paper attached to their shoe now when they walk around? I mean, it's the cool thing to do.
But what's an example, or do you just not have it? I mean, what's an example of the kind of messaging we could have on the left on religious issues like they've got on the right?
Well, for us, we think it's really great to use the actual religious phrases and terminology that people are familiar with and to invoke those.
Works for a lot of things. It works for gays. It works for climate. It works for everything, I would think, for example.
It's really great. And there's a bunch of these, right? Like the Bible's actually full of little catchy phrases that people will remember. So, what we're fond of saying to evangelicals, this passage, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but consider others before yourself.
There you go.
When you say to people, don't be vain, don't be conceited, and consider others, you have a built-in critique of modern day Republican politics and the Trump administration.
Yeah.
Right. We have this little catchphrase when we were touring the country and having events with voters in 2018 and in 2020 in every state in the country. And we, I would often say, look, as a Christian and as a human being, I believe that everyone is the light of the world, the salt of the earth, a beloved child of God. Donald Trump is the light of the world. But not every light of the world should be the president of the United States. And this man needs to take his dim little light and get it out of the White House and stop bothering the good people of this country. So there's a way in which one can acknowledge your conviction of the love of God, that yes, God loves all of us without exception, no qualifications. But not every person loved by God should do everything. And current beloved children of God that are Republicans should stop having the ability to set the agenda for the social policies of this country. Right. Those are not in conflict, that you're going to sort of ignore. You don't have to hate your enemy to say that your enemy shouldn't be the one setting your agenda. And this is the kind of thing that a lot of people, because look, frankly, a lot of voters, they don't vote out of policy. They don't even vote out of values. They vote out of identity. It's how do we see ourselves? And when someone tells you that your social construct for your identity is illegitimate, it doesn't really carry a lot of power. When you call someone to live up to their identity, to say like, I think you see yourself as a good person. How about if that translates into every area of your life, including how you vote? That's a call that for religious people is quite convincing, right? That they shouldn't let their political vote have some exception to goodness.
I wish in some ways we could get more pastors. I mean, so much of how cultures, you brought up identity, so much of how various groups, tribes, whatever you'd like to call them, develop identities is around what they think is, preferred behavior among their peers, acceptable behavior. I so wish that we had more, maybe it's progressive pastors at some more of these churches, or because I feel like if you had people in the community, in these communities constantly sharing this message to push back against everything else that folks are hearing, if they're watching Fox News, if they're hearing their local right-wing politician, who are obviously using the Bible to justify what they're doing and not really based on the Bible at all. I feel like maybe we could change things, and in some places we have, obviously, right? I mean, you can see
totally. Look, there are major issues that a religiously motivated voter, whether they're Catholic or evangelical, especially those two groups, feel out of step with the Republican Party, but they're unwilling to give up their identity as a Republican simply over a policy dispute. But look, I feel that way about being a Democrat. Like, I have some serious policy differences with the way the current Democratic Party is soft selling itself, but I'm unwilling to give it up, my identity for that. And that's, So to ask someone simply to do it out of political expediency is less motivating
right.
than
I don't mean
asking
out of
them to do it out of their
expediency.
own sense. Yeah.
I want to be clear. That wasn't what I meant. It's
I
more
wasn't
a cultural change that
That's right.
obviously would influence politics. That'd be one of the things that would influence, but it would influence the way we live. If, people are being taught in certain areas, by their pastors, by others around them, to be more inclusive, are being taught more about the Good Samaritan than about the border wall, these
That's
kinds
right.
of things.
Yeah, look, and most people that we talk to around the country and are working with, they know very little about politics, right? They don't really know how it works. They don't even understand who their representatives are. We would run events, as I mentioned, around the country, and people would come to our events. They'd be so excited. They say, yes, I'm going to vote for the common good. And then we'd be in conversations afterward, and they would say things like, hey, it's 2018. Why are we having an election this year? That's not we say, well, this is, for the person who's running for the House of Representatives. And they would say, and that's different than the Senate? That's different than my senator?
Well, that's an indictment of our education system too.
And these are people motivated enough to show up at a politically oriented meeting, calling them to live out their faith. So the information people have is far less than the passion that they have. And this is what the religious right takes advantage of all the time. And it's part of what we need to do in our progressive engagements is to be people that help folks feel like they are competent in talking about politics. The biggest thing that I found that keeps people from engaging in politics is they don't like to feel dumb. And if they don't know what's going on and they don't know what's happening, they feel out. So they lean into something they know better, which would be, say, their faith. And so it creates this chasm between their faith and their politics. And then the right wing takes advantage of that and says to them, good people do this. And basically, the religious right says, here's what good people do. And the progressive left says, here's what smart people do. And that idea, and I'm guilty of this myself, of feeling like, if you were more informed, if you were smarter, if you knew what was going on, you would vote or you would think this way. That comes across to people as quite off-putting. And it's it's really hard not to do that, right? I just find myself.
We all do that to a certain degree, man. I think. Yeah.
Can I jump and ask you something, Doug? I'm and Cliff and I often ask our either ex-Republican or never Trumper guests this question about Republicans. And I want to ask it to you about people of faith. I don't understand, as somebody, I was brought up Greek Orthodox. I'd say I'm probably more agnostic now, but Greek Orthodox. But there's still enough of it in me. I don't understand when I talk to people of faith, forget evangelicals, because I'm Greek Orthodox. I don't know any from Chicago. I know no evangelicals, but a lot of people who are Greeks who are basically like Catholics and other similar religions. I don't understand when I talk to Trump voters, friends of my parents, right? I mean, so you're talking very religious immigrant types, from Greece, but immigrants like from the 1930s. So Republicans, whatever. When I talk to them, and they don't simply support Trump because we've got to have the Supreme Court and they understand the importance of the Supreme Court for abortion or whatever. I don't know. And probably, honestly, these people probably don't even care about abortion anyway. But whatever their pet issue is, they actually like Donald Trump. And what I don't understand is, and this comes in more with my faith background, I'd say, he disgusts me. And I still know enough of my Christianity to just see this man and go, why would you not say, look, Donald Trump's a pig. I get it. He doesn't exactly go with my Christian values, but it is important that we fight abortion and blah, 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 right? That I could at least understand logically, even if I don't agree. But a person of faith not saying, yeah, this guy's disgusting. I get it. What is going on in their heads on that?
A friend of mine is.
How do you reach them on that? Or do you not even try to reach them on that?
No, I think you do. I think that's exactly what you have to go after, right? Is why do certain people, religious or not, like to have a strong man in their pantheon of support in their life? I have a friend who's written a book called Jesus and John Wayne, and it's this really great description of what's going on in the religious communities. And that title and that phrase, that people want Jesus that's loving and good and kind, but then they want an ass kicker like John Wayne to get the real work done.
Yeah.
Right. And people assign Donald Trump. I mean, literally religious leaders from the evangelical and conservative worlds were saying this in 2016 and 2020. Like,
they didn't. Yeah, they said it out
need
loud.
a fighter. We need some, like, we'll be the kind ones. We need Donald Trump to get into the swamp and the dirt, and he'll do the dirty job that we haven't had anyone do before. So why someone thinks it's okay to outsource your cruelty and to outsource your piggishness? Well, that's because a lot of us feel like we have that internal, person inside of us, and we kind of want someone to be the fighter for us. And then they just believe that politics is about power and it's a game and it's not real. And this is the thing with my Republican friends that is amazing to me. They think they're playing some higher game, some higher outcome, and politics is just the game that gets you there. They don't understand how much damage it does. They just believe things like, if we just had less government, things would be better. Like,
but let me take it back to the religious people. But sorry, Cliff, but I want to take it back to the religious people. I mean, somehow, and I don't get this though, because I think when you've got, I may not be as religious. I am more, I don't know what you want to call it, but the reason I've been involved in like LGBT activism all these years is, and I would say Cliff with his politics as well, a lot of us on the left are very evangelical about our politics, maybe to use the phrase more ecumenically, meaning we have a passion for what we believe in. We don't just say, well, I took this issue because it's the same industry my dad was in. We're actually in this because we care about it, because we believe in it. It goes to sort of our heart, like why we're involved in it. And it hurts us when we lose. And so I don't understand. I look at religion that way too. And I don't get how you're able to do a cognitive disconnect and say, in essence, the ends justify the means. Yeah, we're going to accept the fact that we're, hiring a philanderer who's a traitor who Jesus, well, I want to say Jesus wouldn't hate, but, wouldn't exactly be, he would be the prostitute Jesus would embrace, basically, this guy. And that knocks the prostitute, to be honest. How they can do that cognitive disconnect when religion typically, I thought, is something that is so central to your being that you don't do in politics. Yeah. In politics, you can have Republicans say, yes, I believe in all these things, but I also believe, hey, you got to get down and dirty and the ends justify the means. Religion isn't supposed to work that way. I realize it does with the Inquisition and stuff, but maybe, and I'll throw this to you, maybe I felt like we'd grown, and I know our listeners are really going to get pissed at me for saying this, that in religious ways people had grown and maybe matured a little, so we got beyond the Inquisition. And the religious right clearly hasn't, though. I mean, obviously they're just, I don't know what
John's lost himself.
I don't get
now.
it. I'm just
please,
stymied.
Doug, jump in and save us.
I'm just stymied. That's the thing. I don't get it, how a religious person is able to do this cognitive disconnect and accept these guys.
Well, this is the dilemma that religion tries to address overall, not just in this particular issue we're talking about with politics, but overall. Why do people do the things they say they don't want to do? Like, why do we live like this? How are we so, like, how did it get to this point? This is what winds someone up talking to their therapist or sitting in a bar talking with the bartender or their best friend, literally thinking like, how did it come to this? How did we get here? There's this famous phrase, from Jesus during his execution where he says, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing.
Right. Yeah.
Like, there's this sense of lostness that we all experience that's like, it doesn't make any sense. So when you realize that this is part of the human experience, that we live in this way that is conflicted with what we want, what we need our politics and our faith to do is to provide for us a way to address that conflict, a solution to it, a pathway out. It's, you want freedom from that sense of feeling all bound up and trapped. And that's the part that's so hard. And I will just simply say this: most religious people, like every other voter, they don't need their candidate to be like them. So it doesn't work to say Donald Trump is nothing like you, because voters don't want their politician to be like them, but they do want their politicians to like them. And the simple fact is, Donald Trump showed up in the religious communities looked these people in the faces and said, I like you. I will represent you. I will be thinking about you.
Right. He didn't trash them
And
until
Democrats, that's right. And Democrats won't show up in those spaces.
And that's a huge
very
mistake.
Often, and this is the thing, we do a lot of training with candidates, and we just say to them, look, make a friend with a person from every religious tradition that you possibly can, including evangelicals. And then you can say, as my friend so-and-so helps me to understand, and then you can reference that person as someone who matters to you. That's the most important thing for most of us,
right,
is that people in power recognize us and we feel like we're liked. And for whatever reason, Republicans give off the attitude, we like religious people, and Democrats give off the attitude, we would prefer you not to talk about if you're religious. And the crazy thing is, so many people we meet who are active in Democratic politics are personally very religious anyway.
Yes.
Members of
it's the
Congress
Democratic presidents who all went to church, right? I mean, like
It's
Reagan
crazy.
never went to church. Trump doesn't go to church. Meanwhile, Biden's there every week.
Yeah, Biden,
Bill Clinton used to go every week.
AOC, I mean, all these people. And I was talking with a staff member, a campaign staffer for a congresswoman who I'm a big fan of. And we were talking about how we could do some work together. And she said, hey, just outside of, out of town here, there's this really big church. And I see their bumper stickers on cars all over. There's thousands of people. Maybe you guys could connect with them and do some work. I said, well, have you ever met them? She said, no, I've never been in their church. Now, here's a staffer for a congresswoman who represents the majority of people that go to that church. But in her mind, she thought, well, they're likely not to vote for us, so I'm not going to reach out to that group. So one of the things we do is try to make, and she was just kind of, she was just thinking like, I don't know them. So we said, well, hey, let's set up a meeting. You can just walk in and say, I have no agenda for you. I just want you to know that we know you, we see you. And if you'd ever be interested in having a forum with the congresswoman for people in your congregation to have a constituency meeting, because they typically don't think about politics, we'd be glad to offer that, because she's here to represent all of you. Like, that's just some basic constituency work that it doesn't seem to be built into the Democratic ethos, where I promise you every mosque in that and Jewish synagogue in that district has had some outreach from the campaign. Right. But the large evangelical church sitting out on the side of the highway that has, 5,000 people showing up on Sundays, very little contact. And one of the things we learned from Katie Porter, actually, out in California, before we even started working with her in 2018, she said, oh, I've been to every evangelical church in my district. I show up and I go shake hands and I stand in the lobby and I say, I'm Katie Porter and I'm running for office and I would love to meet you sometime if you want to talk about that. Right. Like, she was very engaged.
Very good. Yep. At that. And I mean, it seems to me if you just where Democrats make a huge mistake here. I mean, again, this is the cynical political side. I think they should do it anyhow just to get to their constituents and have a conversation. But the cynical political side is in some of these places where, Democrats lost rural, very religious communities. They lost 90-10. Biden, by bringing that down to 80-20 or 75-25, is able to win those states. You know what I mean? I mean, you don't have to win most, but you have to go in and win some. And it makes sense to do it if you're in politics. That's the thing.
That's right. And that's, the thing I should have said at the beginning. The reason I care about this is not because I want politicians to listen to my constituency group and represent evangelicals. Like, that's not what it's about. Evangelicals don't need other people doing their work and bidding in this society and country. They have enough power as it is. The reason we need to do outreach to evangelicals is because there's just so many of them and they're in so many places. Right. And there's no reason to walk away from 50 million or 60 million potential voters and to ignore them. It just doesn't make sense. And it should not cost progressives or conservative Democrats anything to have a connection with these voters, because you're not going to get all of them. But if you can move 5%, 10% in any district, that is often enough to either make a race competitive or to make a difference in the race. So this is really about, it just doesn't make sense to have a bias against a group of people that have so much, they not only have so many people, but they overrepresent in voting. So evangelicals, they show up to vote at a higher rate, even though they're politically uninformed. They do vote, and if you can move a small percentage of them, you're ultimately moving a large number, and that's what we saw with Biden. That's what we saw with Obama. That's what we didn't see in 2016 with Clinton, and it's what we saw in the in all the midterm races.
Right.
And I just want to be clear: like, we should not. This does not mean that you give up on your policy. It doesn't mean you capitulate. It doesn't mean you Joe Manchin this thing. What it means is you say to people, I think you would be pleasantly surprised at the way I view the world and the policies that I want to support if we could have some contact and engagement. The thousands and thousands of voters we've engaged with around the country, many of them will say to us, I have never talked to a Democrat and I've never even looked at the policy positions of Democrats. Like, they're just foreign to me the way that these voters are foreign to the Democrats. So it's this chasm that we're trying to bridge in moments and when it needs to happen. So it's kind of just basic politics that carries a strange religious bias. And again, I understand why people in the Democratic Party and the progressive spaces carry that bias. I've done a lot of LGBTQ work over the last 2 decades, and I know the pain that exists in those spaces, and I know the racism that's embedded inside of evangelicalism has caused significant pain and harm. So there's a lot of harm reduction that has to be done. But the best way to do that is to help free some of these people from their religious stranglehold, or from the Republican stranglehold that they feel that they're trapped in.
I mean, that makes a lot of sense. And again, like, it just makes sense that you need to be engaging everyone. I mean, the classic example is, look, Trump's campaign, which has a lot of rhetoric. I'm not going to even soft pedal it. He says racist things all the time. He's a racist. And with all these things he said, their campaign made it their business to reach out to Latina voters and to Black voters. And they gained 2% or something with Black voters, and they gained scarily about 9%, in the Hispanic community. And that may have been the difference in a few places, certainly in North Carolina, where, I mean, I'm talking on the presidential level here, where you get down to smaller levels, but on the presidential level, where Biden lost, I think, North Carolina by 1.25 points. Yes. That could be the difference. We lost Florida. Certainly, we know we saw what happened in Miami-Dade in some of these areas. Texas wouldn't have been a 5-point or whatever it was loss. Probably would have been more like a 2 or 3 point loss, and a lot closer if that hadn't happened. So, I mean, these are all very important. If they know they need to have those conversations with our voters, for us to not have them with people that we assume right away are their voters is just, you don't give up on people. That's not how you build coalitions in politics. Culturally, I think what you're doing, Doug, is so much more important. By the way, I do enjoy saying your name because my son's name is Doug, and we're very big Doug and Dougie fans around this house.
Is that right? How old is your son? Because I've never met anyone under the age of 50 that's a Doug.
That's hilarious. So, by the way, I'm
point. Actually, you're right.
It is a really funny point because I'm 49.
Okay.
And my middle name is Douglas, and my parents just loved the name. So they gave it to me, and we sort of felt like, even though it hadn't been in my family before, we're like, let's make it a family name, and so that's why we named him that. We just love the name, and I never used it. It was my middle name. I never used for anything. But there are a few out there his age. I think he's met 2 or 3 others, but it definitely has a name. It's Nosedived. It's not. It was definitely the same with thing. I'm named Cliff. That took a nosedive about 100 years ago. So we have some interesting names. Right. In any case, all right.
Sort of fell off the cliff.
Well put. To go back to before I admired your name, what we were talking about. I feel like the cultural part of this that people don't understand. I mean, you can always quote who was it? The Italian Marxist whose name's not coming to me right now. First you change the culture, then you change the politics. Culture is the space that allows politics to operate. So the truth of the matter is that, as you pointed out, so much of this is identity. And when people who don't know what they believe are hanging around with other people who have strong opinions who are right away like, oh, you can't vote for a Democrat, you're a Republican, we're lost already. By just operating in the spaces and creating, I hate to use the phrase because how it's used these days, but a safe space or whatever you'd like to call it, a space where people feel like they can actually proudly speak out about why they're Democrats because of Jesus's teachings and how it's completely consistent with what they believe. And not just what Jesus' teachings, but in general, what the ethic is supposed to be of how you're supposed to behave towards your fellow woman and man and your neighbor and others, that could be powerful. I'm sure you make it powerful in the places where you go and you speak so I mean, I think for our listeners, it's so important to understand this, that the Christian right, as Doug pointed out, I mean, this is the moral majority that got together and made a deal to Falwell gang. As you can tell, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree with the next generation. We won't even get into pool boys and such. But what we will say is that it was not always that way. A lot of the most religious thinkers were actually a lot of the most progressive thinkers. I bring up MLK, and I wish, as a history guy, I would sit here and list so many of the other ones for you who are out there, because there's a time I could have listed them off, the top of my head. But even on a lot of things, eventually maybe not so good on evolution and such, but William Jennings Bryan, cross of gold, so to speak, right? I mean, these we have a history of this. It's led to a lot of change. A lot of the churches were the ones pushing for the right for women, guaranteed right for women to vote. Methodist churches and others back in the early 20th century. Like, this is not some of the homes, I don't know what we'd call them now. Definitely what they were saying back then was not some language we'd use today. But for those who were, either homeless or others, were supported by religious organizations, they still are to a certain degree. I'm just saying,
that's right.
And there's a huge social good here. I know, living here I mean, knew before I lived here, but living in Cincinnati and the social side of Catholicism, the part where you're pro-union, anti-death penalty, the part where you believe in workers' rights and you believe in the dignity of human beings and these other things. There's a lot there if we're willing to go have our folks go out and talk about it.
Yeah, that's exactly. You think back when you were 8 years old, the president of the United States was an evangelical Democrat named Jimmy Carter.
Great point.
And now by the time you're 48 years old, the Republican Party has taken over the religious expression of many people in this country, where 50% or more of every Christian tradition votes for Republicans regularly. So that didn't happen by some act of nature. That's a social construct that was made and created. And at that time, 40 years ago, California was a red state. And now it's, deep blue. And Arkansas 5-7 years ago was a battleground state. And before that had been very blue. So these
Bill
things
Clinton
are
came from Arkansas and we won that state easily in 92. And yep, you're exact. People need to look at those. I'm sorry to interrupt. You go ahead.
No, please. You can interrupt all you want. And so the question is, what are things going to look like in 20 years and in 40 years? And you realize that these kinds of, there are some demographic and societal shifts, but the shifts that are organized, the shifts that are engaged by systems and structures are the ones that tend to last. So if we want to have our, the generation of children today to look back and say, man, when I was a kid, it seemed like all the religious people were Republicans. What happened? How come it's not that way anymore? Which is part of my goal for the next 20 years of my life. You actually have to do the work to make that happen, right? So people will look back and say, religious people were at the forefront of immigration change, or at the forefront of making sure that healthcare was seen as something that everyone had access to, not just the insurance was something that people had access to, that people feel like caring for the environment was championed by people who say they love God. Like, how can you love God and treat the planet with such disregard? So these are not difficult ideas to move on. They've been in place before. The seeds are there for them to be in place again. And the political parties are in a time of morphing, and they're in a time of shifting. Now, we can't end up with a religious party that's running the Democratic or a religious movement that's running the Democratic Party. That would not be good. Religion is not a good way to run your government. Religion is a good way to motivate your citizens to engage with their government.
Exactly
And
right. Yeah.
that difference is really important. And I hear a lot of people on the religious left that kind of sound like Christian nationalists at times, right? Where they're like, they want their values to be expressed in their policies. Like a mature religious person needs to know that your religious demands in this country should not be fulfilled by your government. Your religious demands should drive you to the common good, that the government needs to be thinking about people that hold your religious views and hold other views that are nowhere close to your own. That's the pluralistic expression that we really have to work hard to get to, because Christian nationalism is a serious threat to the well-being of this country and this planet, and we can't drift into that lane just for the expediency of winning elections.
Let me step back a second and ask you, because again, every time, not every time, but a lot of times when I've brought up religion or I try to make a religious argument, a lot of people on the left push back because historically they've had, some, I think just intellectually, right? Whether you're science minded or whatever, they're just not very, they kind of think religion is a lie, literally a lie. It's fantasy, whatever, it's myth. A lot of others have been brought up and been so castigated and downtrodden because of religion, and they've seen the way religion has treated others they care about, other groups they care about, if you're a good liberal, good progressive, that people almost get sort of upset with me sometimes, I think, whenever I bring up religion. And somebody like, Pete Buttigieg brought up religion in a wonderful way during the campaign, during the primaries, to really go after Mike Pence. And I mean, I was howling what he was doing. And some people, I knew as soon as I tweeted about it, some people would get upset because, see, Pete's talking about being a Christian. He's obviously not very good. We don't like those Christians. How do you convince people?
But that's the Twitter left, as you know, John, that we need to ignore.
But that's my question for Doug, though. I don't know. Is it just sort of the Twitter left that Cliff and I deal with, where it's a very small segment of the left, or is there a larger issue on the left of almost having an animosity towards religion? And what's your message to convince them that this discussion matters?
It's not just the Twitter left. Back in 2010, I was seeking the endorsement to run for the state legislature in Minnesota, where I live. And at one of the conventions, you have this time where you ask people to join into conversation groups. So there's 300 people in the room, and people would stand. I was up as a potential candidate. And then I said, and one of the things I'd like to talk about, in this breakout groups after this are, what should be the role of Christian faith for voters and our policy. So if anyone wants to be, and then other people would stand up. There are probably 20 topics that were raised, right? So then you'd hold up a little flag with your topic on it, and people would go to those corners, and then you'd break off and have these conversations. 0 people came to the conversation on the role of religion in democratic politics in Minnesota. 0 people. And I didn't take it personally. I did a fine presentation. People were very kind to me. There is a well-earned nervousness about this. And so rather than saying to those people who are going to come out with a reaction of, we need less religion in our world, not more, I think we need to give them a good hard listen and understand where that's coming from and acknowledge that they may be right. The thing is, that's just not the way the world is right now. That religion motivates people, their faith motivates them to love and good deeds. And while we can say, even people that say, like, I don't go to church, I don't hold my faith, it's not important to me, deep down, they still sort of identify themselves that way. It's the most curious thing. Like what they tell pollsters and what they tell, individuals about their own religious behavior is not the same thing as their self-identity. So I think we have to acknowledge that religion can be a very dangerous force in a pluralistic society of democratic politics. And because it's dangerous, we have to treat it with the seriousness that it deserves, but ignoring it or castigating people to leave the party or to not talk about something that actually motivates them. That hasn't worked well, and I don't think it's going to work well going forward. And we just need to find more sophisticated ways to engage on these issues, and we all have to get better at it. And that's partly. I mean, I'm willing to stand in a lot of rooms with Democratic operatives, and when they find out what we do, they're like, "Hey, Godspeed to you, man. Good luck with that crowd." And then they're just like, I don't want to have anything to do with that. We get it from potential donors. We get it from partners. So, but that's just the conditions that we're working in, right? It's a tough sell in that part of the world right now.
And I think what you just said, though, I mean, you nailed it, though, which is the way to speak about this. I mean, I get it. People not thinking, I don't want our government tied to religion. That never turns out well anywhere in history, but that doesn't mean that people that are motivated, that find their inspiration in religion to do good things, shouldn't come out and have that be a part of our conversation. And I think you can do both of those things. You just did, Doug. I mean, you went and said, came out and said very simply that what I just said about government, you don't want government of religion. At the same time, can't we be motivated by and inspired by these acts, by our faith, and I think that's a conversation that if more Democrats would step up and talk about, on the left, the right wouldn't have such a monopoly on being the quote unquote ones who represent religion. So I wish more would. Can I
tell you a little story about how that happened at one of our events? There was a person she was representing. She was in the state legislature. She was running for Congress. This was back in October, and we did an event with her. And we called our events "Faith, Hope, and Love for a Change on Election Day," right? So really targeted for these faith voters. So we're outside at a park, socially distanced event. She's speaking to the group, and she said, "Hey, I'm really glad to be at this event. Often when we start giving our little stump speeches, like I'm going to do here, I have all the things I normally say. And one thing I never really say is that growing up, my mom was our pastor, and I grew up in a family where my mom, was the primary political driving force and spiritual driving force in my family. So it's kind of fun to be able to share that at this event. I normally don't talk about that." Then a little while later, she said, "I go knocking on doors and I go up to houses and people say to me, 'Well, I'm a Christian, so I vote for the Republican.'" She said, "I just don't understand that." Now, she found no irony in the fact that she's an elected official now running for Congress who never tells people what her mom did for a living when she was growing up. Had her mom been a Marine, do you think she wouldn't have said, "I grew up and my mom was in the military"?
Right.
But for some reason, here an elected official as a Democrat seeking the office of federal representative has chosen to edit out that she has a religious background herself and that her mom was her driving force for her sense of goodness and for her political imagination. Now, what creates that? Do you think a Republican who had their parent was a pastor wouldn't, that wouldn't be line one on their
You'd
biography?
hear it all day long. And it's so easily messaged.
Just tell the truth, right?
Yep.
You don't have to make up other stuff. So this is the part that you think, okay, what's the culture then? The societal culture, the political culture, the religious culture that has people put on their mute button when it comes to this part of the conversation. So we're not asking Democrats to do anything different. We're just asking them to engage with people, to like them, and to tell the truth. And, some of our best candidates have been people like, "Look, I'm not religious at all. I don't go to church. I never went to church. I'm the kind of person that, you were worried about in high school, if you're a religious person. But I'll tell you this, I know what you care about, and I care about those things too, and I'm with you." Like, that works. That you don't have to sort of feign, and we've watched candidates do this all the time. They'll show up, and one guy, literally his campaign manager said, "Hey, sorry about that opening to his talk there." He was trying to memorize John 3:16 in the car on the way over here because he wanted to incorporate "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son," and he messed it up, and instead of just saying like, "I don't even know a single Bible passage, but I know you," which would have been a great line, right? He tried to feign a little bit of religious usage. So he sounds like Donald Trump saying, in 2 Corinthians, or in 2 Corinthians,
2 Corinthians,
right?
walk into a bar.
And that didn't cost Donald Trump anything. You know why it didn't cost him anything? Yeah. Because he was standing in the chapel at Liberty University.
Yeah.
And people were like, "That's going to hurt him with evangelicals." Like,
but we
no,
didn't
he
respond
showed
either.
up.
We didn't show up and stand up. Yes, that's
Right.
exactly it.
So it's not overly complicated, but 40 years of a community feeling that to be religious means to not be a Democrat. That has permeated, especially certain parts of the society, and that barrier, that permanent barrier, is starting to break, and we're trying to do everything we can to, wedge a water crack in that, and make that more normative for people to say, not that Democrats are a religious party, but that Democrats can compete for religious voters on as even of a playing field as possible.
Yep.
Would be really great, because look, the black church tends to vote for Democrats at a 90% clip.
Right.
Now, do you think every single person that goes to a black church understands democratic politics?
Well, they disagree with some of the social agenda, and they still
That's right.
do it. Yep.
They still do it. It's part of the identity. So you could see some movement. We're never going to get to parity with evangelicals or with white Catholics,
We don't have
conservative
to.
Catholics. But if you can, can get to 70%, 65, if 65% of evangelicals supported Republicans without question, and the other 35% were up for grabs, it would change the landscape of politics in this country.
Yep.
And that's actually possible. That's a very doable thing. Donald Trump is the gift that keeps on giving, to this. He just continues to alienate portions. I know people think that no, the evangelicals are hardwired in. He's bleeding evangelicals all the time, so much so that their campaign had to organize in 2020 evangelicals for Trump campaign, because they saw the numbers and they know that, the only group of people that actually flipped demographic wise, meaning more of these people voted for Trump in 2016 and less of them voted for Trump in 2020, were white Christian males.
Interesting.
Unbelievable. Right?
Yeah.
And only in the most religious parts of Michigan, what were in the two counties in Michigan, was there actually a flip. That's Grand Rapids and Holland, Michigan, where Betsy DeVos was from, the most religious part of Michigan, that went from voting for Trump in 2016 to not voting for Trump in 2020. And along with the African-American turnout in the urban centers, that's what caused the difference in Michigan, and the same thing in Wisconsin. So these are very real, very, very real implications. And you could see these things happening in parts of Texas and in North Carolina. And, probably not going to get there in Arkansas and West Virginia in this cycle, but in 20 years you could get there, just by getting somewhere near parity on the turnout
Well, that's
turnout model.
Probably a perfect place for us to wrap it, I think. Thank you so much for being here, Doug. Are you? I'll ask you in 2 seconds, because I know John really has to go too. Are you on AM 950, or is that a thing of the past?
I'm not currently on AM 950, but I used to be on, but then I went on the road for a year. So
right. I go on regularly on my friend Matt McNeil's show on there. I'm actually going on today. So
I was on right after Matt. Tell Matt hello.
I will.
I used to slide in the studio and sit right in his warmed chair right after him. Yeah.
He's a fantastic guy. All right. Well, we better jump, because John has issues to solve, and
I have issues to solve
and places to be. But Doug, this is a great talk, an important one, and we're going to promote it best we can everywhere. Thank you so much for being here.
This is wonderful. Thank you.
Real pleasure. Thanks, guys. Good to know you.
Take care.
Okay. See ya.
That was great. That was Doug Pagit, our executive director, on the Unpresidented Podcast. And we'll drop links in the show notes so you can check that out directly. And we'll be back Monday for the news, Tuesday for politics, Wednesday is Faith Day with our panel of pastors. Thursday is Bigger Issues. We dive deep into some of the headlines, get beyond the headlines, and see what's really going on in the world, and try to kind of find a common good way forward in the world together. And the next Friday, we'll be back to science. And so we'll see you all soon. Have a great weekend.